All right, welcome everyone to our third class in this Discovering Buddhism module, The Wisdom of Emptiness. We've been starting our class with the recitation of the Heart Sutra. So we're going to start there as well tonight. So you should all have that on the screen, and we'll just recite this, trying to bring to mind whatever understanding we have of this topic of emptiness, okay? By the way, and usually when this is recited, there's just a short homage verse that's just before it, and it's Om I prostrate to the Arya triple gem. Again, Aryas are those beings who've realized emptiness directly, and so we're prostrating to the three jewels who are Arya beings. Om I prostrate to the Arya triple gem. Thus did I hear at one time the Bhagawan was dwelling on Massive Vulture's mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagawan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the endpoint of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly, completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Tayata Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhi Swaha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagawan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagawan, having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvati Putra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagawan. Then we'll go to the short mandala offering prayer. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And Refuge in Bodhicitta, which, as usual, we'll do the first time in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jang tu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye druparsho sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangtu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye druparsho. Okay, let's do a short meditation. Again, we'll spend the first few minutes doing single-pointed meditation on the breath. This is the topic of last week's class, right? We spent a fair amount of time looking at how we develop this very stable mind of calm abiding. So we're just, every time we do this, we're simply practicing, trying to keep our awareness on a single object, in this case, the breath. So again, choose whatever way you prefer to work with the breath and try to stay with the breath. And when you see that the mind wanders, and just gently guide the mind back to the breath. So I'll ring the chime here in the Gompa to start the meditation, and then I'll come in a few minutes and lead you in setting motivation. So now let's set our motivation. And perhaps even in this short meditation on the breath, we've experienced a small taste of some peace when our minds are not even caught up in all the discursive thought that they usually have. There's that window kind of shows us the potential that we have in our minds to experience true peace. And the Buddha teaches a path that will lead to that. And we have the amazing good fortune of having met with these teachings. And the teachings will help us, if we practice them correctly, to not only attain our own freedom from suffering, our own individual peace, but moreover, be able to help all others, to help them to attain the peace that they seek, to be free from all the dissatisfaction, the suffering, the problems, the difficulties that they experience. So generate the mind of bodhicitta as your motivation for tonight. It's particularly important with these teachings on emptiness that we have that mind that wants these teachings, not for our own welfare, not for our own freedom from samsara, from the round of existence, but mainly so that we can help others to achieve the freedom they seek. We're here with that compassionate motivation, focused on the welfare of all beings, within the recognition that to accomplish the welfare of others, we have to develop ourselves. We have to attain the culmination of our own potential, the complete peace of Buddhahood, a state in which we will then be able to work tirelessly and spontaneously for the welfare of others. So again, hold that motivation of bodhicitta very deeply in your heart for tonight's teachings, so that everything we do becomes a cause for that result. Okay, and good to see you all again tonight. In the last class, again, we worked with the teachings on developing concentration, calm abiding, this very powerful state of mind that allows us to be single-pointedly focused on whatever object we choose. And again, the reason why I like to review this, not just because His Holiness has it in his wonderful book, but it's an important topic to use in conjunction with these teachings on developing insight into emptiness. Because without a very powerful foundation for the work with emptiness, it'd be very hard for those meditations and our reflections on emptiness to kind of hit home, to really cause a deeper change in our perspective and our way of being. One thing that I mentioned last week that I wanted to share, I was talking about the various levels, the 9 mental abidings that you go through to get to calm abiding. And I mentioned that there was one teacher, I couldn't remember last week who it was, who taught that you can, in a daily life, accomplish some progress on those levels. But in order to go much deeper, you generally do need to have a more committed practice, probably in a retreat setting. And that was actually in Alan Wallace's book, The Attention Revolution, that I mentioned last week. And it's on page 8 in his introduction. And he talks about how most people would find their lives greatly enhanced just by attaining the second stage of these stages of developing the mind to calm abiding. He says 10 stages. That's because he includes calm abiding as the final stage, the 9 mental abidings we went through, and then the culmination in that state of calm abiding. And he says this level of development takes some effort, but it can be achieved by people who are living a busy life with career and family commitments, as long as they are willing to set aside some time for meditation. It can dramatically improve the quality of everything you do and make you more resilient in the face of emotional and physical stressors. If that is your goal, there's no problem with using the techniques in this book for that purpose. He says, however, this book is also a guide for people who wish to go well beyond what are considered normal levels of attention, For most people, achieving the third stage will require a greater commitment than an hour or two spent each day in meditation in the midst of an active life. The more advanced stages of attentional development are accessible to people who dedicate themselves to weeks or months of rigorous practice in a conducive environment. Progress beyond the fourth attentional stage, the fourth mental abiding that we talked about, requires a vocational commitment to this training, which may involve full-time practice for months or years at a stretch, which again is really only possible within some form of a retreat environment. So these are things that, again, we can't necessarily accomplish perhaps with our busy lives that we have now, but at least we can set the stage for that. And all the meditation that we do now, whatever time we can devote in our day to doing some measure of stabilizing meditation, placement meditation, using a single object, and stay with that single object. Once you find one that's working for you, whether it be, again, an image of a Buddha or the breath or whatever it is that you prefer to work with, then stick with that one. Try to kind of hone your meditation with regard to that single object. And over time, you will see some change. It's not a direct kind of like trajectory from no attention at all to like this really increased amazing attention. It's going to go all over the place. Our meditation is going to be different from day to day. And I don't think I really need to explain that to most of you. You probably have already had that experience with your meditation. But just persist. Have that continuous practice day after day, and you will see some change. So I wanted to check in before we start tonight's topic, just to make sure that there weren't any questions from last week or from your reviewing the material from last week. Anything? Because I realized I did cram an awful lot into last week's session. It was a lot on these techniques for developing calm abiding. So, and hopefully you've had a chance to read Papanka Rinpoche's text and even His Holiness's bit on concentration, because he didn't go into great detail, but he does kind of review the main points. So, all right. Well, if there are no questions, then let's carry on. Tonight, we're going to begin to work really with the whole teachings on emptiness in much more depth. The topic for tonight is undermining ignorance through the reasoning of dependent arising. So what I'd like to do to kind of get us started is to go back to 2 weeks ago. And at the end of that first class, I introduced to you this whole concept of the tree of samsara. So let me go ahead and pull that up again on the screen, and we'll go from there. And I've got a number of things to share with you tonight on that. So tonight, in terms of this presentation, I am going to start with the tree of samsara and talking about how we identify that ignorance that is the root, and the relationship of that, of course, to emptiness and the wisdom of emptiness that we need to cultivate. Then I will go on to take a look at seeing the interdependence of phenomena with what we are calling the reasoning or the analysis of dependent arising. And this is taught towards the beginning of His Holiness's book. And it actually is a very good place for it because it's a wonderful way to enter into the world of analyzing for emptiness. The third is to use that reasoning to overcome what are called the two extreme views. I'll go into more detail when we get to that. And then finally, to see the equality of dependent arising and emptiness. This is the whole point of tonight, is to get you to see that when we come to the conclusion that things are dependent arisings, that very meaning of that is equivalent to their emptiness. So, and this is what we're going to cover tonight. Hopefully I'll have time for all of this. So again, when I put up this graphic a few weeks ago, I use this frequently. There is a nice little passage in His Holiness's book that I'll share with you where he talks about cutting the roots of samsara. So I don't know where I got the idea for this, maybe from him, maybe from other teachers. I think it's a common analogy. But once more, when we go to the very bottom of the screen, we see that the roots, the first element that is involved in this, is the ignorance that we're going to be going into in detail on initially tonight. This ignorance clings to the I, that individual person, ourselves, and all phenomena, which means everything other than persons. Because we also can cling to, other persons as being inherently existent. But the idea is we cling to everything to be truly or inherently existent. We're going to talk about that in a moment. What does that mean? Because these are just, again, words, unless we actually go to the depth of defining what that is referring to. What is that misconception, that ignorance? Number two, the trunk. The trunk of the tree includes both the wholesome and unwholesome thoughts we cultivate within our ignorance. Because, again, as long as we are in samsara, there will be some flavoring of our thoughts with that ignorance until actually we begin the process of exiting samsara, when we become an Arya being. Mentioned that in the prayer tonight for the Heart of Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, how we prostrate to these beings who have that direct knowledge. Until we get that direct knowledge, we're going to be under the control of our ignorance to a large degree. So most of our thoughts are arising with that ignorance, whether they're wholesome or unwholesome. And then, based on that, we create karma, either with our minds alone, or with our speech, or our physical actions. And that's the karma, the branches that we are developing that send out the potential for fruit to come. And that's generally virtuous or non-virtuous, though we also have some actions that are neutral. So the branches give rise to the fruit. And the fruits are here, they look all alike, but obviously we experience different fruits. Fruits of suffering, meaning painful existences, experiences within various existences. And then, of course, the happiness, the more favorable existences and the more beneficial experiences that we have. These arise from our karma. So it's a very direct process. From ignorance gives rise to these various states of mind. Those minds arise within that ignorance. Then the karma is occurring on the basis of the thoughts and actions we engage in, and then we have the fruit of that eventually. So let's talk about this root of ignorance. One thing in terms of this phrase, inherent existence, that I'm going to start with, is the idea of the ways that His Holiness and Jeffrey Hopkins in the book talk about it, because I think it's very rich in terms of giving us some other ideas of what this means. Usually when I throw out the terms intrinsic or inherent existence, people just kind of scratch their heads, because what does that really mean? The first one on there, existing in and of themselves by way of their own nature. You take it off screen and talk about that for a moment. We do have to say that things do have their own nature. I mean, the color red is very different than the color blue, right? There's a redness to red, there's a blueness to blue. But existing by way of their own nature in and of themselves means that from the side of the red, from the side of the blue, they're able to establish themselves. They exist by way of their own nature. Their own nature is resident within them, as opposed to being dependent upon other factors outside of them. So this is getting at this idea of what we mean by inherent is something that is able to set itself up within having its own nature. And that is how it is established. And this, again, is a false conception. This inherent existence, everything that I put on the screen just a short while ago and that we're going to go through is referring to something that we believe in our heart of hearts, but it doesn't exist at all. Just like if someone, a young child, were to believe that there's a boogeyman in the closet or something, and every night they go to sleep, they have incredible fear because they're convinced that there's this monster in the closet or whatever that's going to come out and get them. We live our lives believing in something that isn't there at all. Just like this child will have fear and all sorts of problems because of this conviction that there's something horrible there. Again, if we saw that suffering going on, we'd be moved to say, no, there's no monster, there's no boogeyman. Let me show you, and try to reveal that. This is the same thing the Buddha did for us, to say, guess what, folks? What you've been believing in, your boogeyman, this inherent existence, you need to see that it doesn't exist at all. And in that first one, it's the idea that things aren't able to establish themselves by way of their own nature. The redness, blueness doesn't come from the side of the object. It is the nature of that object. But as we're going to see tonight, it's dependent upon other factors. It's not how the redness and blueness are established on their own, by way of their own nature. The second one there, having a sense of concreteness, he uses this term concrete a couple of times. Concreteness meaning kind of, again, a solidity and a essence from the side of the object that is there, established. And another term that sometimes they use in some of the texts is objective existence. kind of having the existence from the side of the object. The third one, existing independently without depending on other factors for its existence. Well, this, of course, is steering us into what we're going to be talking about tonight. When we think of this false mode of existing that we are believing in as independent existence, well, then anything that shows dependent existence and that things actually depend upon others rather than are independent of other factors flies right in the face and becomes a direct contradiction to what we are believing in. But whenever we encounter an object, we think that it has its own independent entity. Again, out there on the object, from the side of the object, we have to begin to see. And the reason why I'm spending a bit of time on this is because they point out that this is the most crucial step in any analysis. We have to see this false way that we are clinging to things, that we believe in their mode of existence, that they are existing that way. Then we know what we're refuting. We know what we need to develop the antidote towards. Because otherwise, we're going to get confused about, well, what is it that we're actually refuting? What is it that I'm actually believing in? Because this ignorance is not just not knowing how things exist, it's believing in a fictitious way of existing. And as if that actually did exist, if things had their own entity, their own ability to set themselves up, their own objective existence. And we're going to talk shortly about how that is how things even appear to us. So all we have to do is become aware of how things appear. As I said, whenever we see an object, it seems to be established on its own in some independent manner, not even related to kind of factors involving us, much less all the other factors that were involved in its arising. So we'll get into this tonight. This is one of the phrases that is really powerful for us to meditate on, is to think about how this is what we mean by inherent existence. We are believing in things existing independently with no dependence on other factors. Even though we don't kind of go through a thought process, we don't analyze for that. This is what we're going to be trying to do tonight with what we're talking about. Let's analyze and see how things actually do exist. We'll find that this mode of existing doesn't exist, that we're looking at in terms of this, what ignorance is believing in. There's concretely again on page 30, concretely and autonomously. This word autonomous, again, meaning things have their own kind of self-establishment. They exist on their own, autonomously. Even that next phrase, as self-sufficient entities, kind of sufficient in and of themselves. This whole concept of things being self-sufficient is refuted by what we're going to be talking about tonight. And especially, as is said in that second line, independent of consciousness. Something we're going to be pursuing tonight is, where do things actually come from in terms of what establishes their existence? And in the end, we're going to find that it's established through consciousness. Consciousness is the main factor that gives rise to what does exist and what doesn't exist. There is a basis for it, but as we'll go into tonight, our consciousness is involved in establishing things as existent. The final one on your screen there, existing under its own power, kind of things having a power and ability to once more set themselves up, to establish themselves. Where's the power coming from? The power seems to be coming from all these objects that are all around us, that our senses are engaging in, that have the ability to establish themselves. And if you think about it, we do have this kind of concept that everything kind of is waiting for us to identify what it already is established as. That things come into our lives, that we learn what how to identify the various things, but they already had that identity. Someone clued us into that. Most of the things, I wouldn't say most, maybe, I don't know, a good share of the things we learn that we deal with in our life, we get from a very young age, right? When we're taught this is this, that is that, and so on. Kind of organize our world, but we think that the world's already organized that way. We think that we're simply learning what they are, but they've already been that. Chair has always been a chair. We're just learning that it's a chair. Its chairness seems to be by way of its own power, by way of its own side, from its own nature. All these kinds of phrases that get at the fictitious way that we think things are able to be established. But this, again, is what ignorance is doing, is it's kind of grasping at that and thinking that that is real. It's interesting, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our kind spiritual director who passed away in April, when he would teach on emptiness, he would say that what ignorance is believing in is the real chair or the real I, using that word real. Now, does that mean when we come to see that that doesn't exist, that there's no reality at all? No, it just means that the way we think of real, the way that we deal with our reality, is as if that was factual. We think that what appears to us as real is how it exists, that it has that ability to set itself up, that everything is established on its own, that it has, again, that existence that's objectively out there as opposed to something that we're intimately involved in the process of establishing. So this is what we're going to be referring to and talking about. Now, again, we have many other forms of ignorance that the Buddha pointed out to us. This course isn't about examining all of those. Throughout discovering Buddhism, you've been undermining other areas of ignorance. For example, our ignorance of karma, the law of cause and effect, that is operative all the time. That is something that we need to have great conviction in. Our ignorance of the nature of samsara, which was taught back in Module 9, right, where we didn't really come to understand the suffering nature, the unsatisfactory nature of existence. All of these things are helping to undermine other levels of ignorance. But this one, again, is the root one. So you might hear the term ignorance being referred to in a more general way to any time that we are not knowing or misknowing things. But here, whenever I use ignorance, I'm going to be specifically referring to this ignorance that is mistakenly grasping at ourselves and everything that exists as if they had that power, as if they were set up on their own by way of their own nature and so on. So again, in His Holiness's book, this is what's explained primarily in the first chapter. And I had you read the first chapter, I think, after the first class. But I'm just kind of going back and referring to some of the concepts there because it's important before we even get into this first reasoning to know what it is we're refuting, what it is that we are actually denying in the process of our analysis. Otherwise, again, our analysis isn't going to hit home. It's not going to actually get at the target. The whole point of this is to remove the ignorance that is holding on to something as real. If we are able to refute what it's holding on to, then we are able to overcome that ignorance because it no longer will have any conviction in that. And we will replace that ignorance with the wisdom that sees things as they really are, as His Holiness says, see yourself as you really are. Really see this subtle way that things actually do exist. Now, there's a lot more that I could say about this ignorance and the role that it plays for the bodhisattvas, those beings who, again, are motivated by bodhicitta. This is where we are trying to cultivate that mind of bodhicitta continually. This is the first obstacle they have to overcome, is this ignorance and the afflictions that arise from that. And then eventually, once they have exhausted that, they can go on to remove even subtler imprints in our mind. And we'll talk a little bit about that later tonight. But know that this is a key component for both of those beings who, the beings who want to be free from samsara, who want to remove their own ignorance so they can attain the state of nirvana, but also for bodhisattvas who want to go on to Buddhahood. Without the wisdom realizing emptiness, we aren't going to be able to accomplish that. So again, His Holiness has this whole section about kind of the source of problems. I've talked about that a bit already. I might mention a few things on that though, and that's just to give us a little bit more idea of how this operates when we are grasping at things as if they had that reality. How does this occur? Well, let's talk about kind of the two main experiences that we encounter. We have pleasant things that we encounter primarily through our senses. We do have mental things that we bring up that can be seen as pleasurable, but frequently it is in the field of what we are experiencing through our senses. And then we have the unpleasant things that we are experiencing. Well, whenever we encounter something that is pleasant or unpleasant, we are generally under the control of this ignorance. That ignorance, first of all, with regard to the pleasurable object, thinks that that pleasure is kind of inherent within the object. And moreover, then goes on to exaggerate the pleasantness of that object and develop what we call the mind of attachment. The mind of attachment is one of these delusions, these afflictions that arise from our ignorance. But the initial ignorance is where we are thinking that, well, there's an element also of thinking that the object exists in reality. But we're primarily, when we get the delusions involved, we're mostly looking at the qualities of those objects. So say it's your birthday and somebody puts a wonderful piece of cake or pie, whatever you prefer to eat for your birthday, some delicious dessert in front of you. As soon as that appears to your eye consciousness, and of course, before you've even tasted it, maybe you haven't even smelled the cake, you're just seeing it. It seems to be kind of covered in pleasantness, right? The entire thing, completely pleasant, right? And because that's our favorite dessert, we have an overlay of all kinds of pleasantness that is not really there. It's our relationship to that object that has created that exaggeration of the pleasantness. And how do we know that the pleasantness itself isn't even resident there, isn't even inherent there? Because not everybody's going to like that dessert that we like, right? Maybe you invite several people to your party and one of the people brings this favorite dessert, a huge cake, and they cut it up for everybody and one person goes, "No, I don't really want a piece. It's nothing I'm attracted to," right? Well, are they wrong and everybody else at the party is right? You know, that there's really some pleasantness inherent in there and this person simply isn't seeing it? No, it's just that everyone in the room who enjoys the cake has that kind of conditioning to enjoy what that cake is, chocolate cake, carrot cake, lemon cake, whatever cake it is. They have a prior pattern through their karma, through what they have done, that makes those things appear pleasant to them. They're conditioned to see it as pleasant, and they enjoy the cake because of that. But the additional overlay causes them to develop an attachment to that cake. Not only do they have the karma to see it pleasant, but through the force of their ignorance, they are exaggerating the pleasantness, grasping at it as real, and not wanting to be parted from that cake, wanting to make sure they get every little bit of it off the plate and what have you. I mean, this is how we live in terms of our sense objects, is we're continually chasing after what is pleasant, thinking that if we get more and more of that, it's going to satisfy us. We're blind to any unpleasant aspects of that cake. And they are there, right? I mean, if you sat down and ate a bunch of cake, you know what would happen to your system. And you know that in the long term, having those sorts of foods is not necessarily that good for you. There are some unpleasant things that we're not even looking at that point. When we're totally caught up in the pleasantness of the cake and exaggerating those qualities, we are completely blind to anything that is unattractive or unfavorable. On the other hand, when we hear or see or touch or taste something that is unpleasant for us, then we have the exact opposite type of reaction, but it's grounded in the same way. It's an unpleasant object for us, again, due to our past conditioning and karma. And we have that reaction of wanting to push it away, some aversion energy. But moreover, we're exaggerating the unpleasantness of that, kind of creating a whole fiction on top of that. But again, is the unpleasantness inherent within that object? Let's choose some music. Think about the music that you don't like to hear. You know, if you go to somebody's house and they were to put that on, you'd kind of go, "Oh my God, what are you doing playing that music?" Right? We all have that, right? Something that we are karmically conditioned to hear as noise or something upsetting to us, rather than something that we go, "Oh, this is lovely music. This is great. Thank you for putting that on," right? Again, someone else has a different taste in music than we have. What we would put on as our favorite music, they would go, "Oh, that's horrible music. Why don't you put on my kind of music," right? Who's right and wrong? That's not the issue. We each are conditioned to see something pleasant or unpleasant in various objects. Through the force of our karma, through the force of what we've done in this life, and so on, we develop our own conditioning that allows us to tap into certain things as pleasant or unpleasant. And that can even change, right? I had a strong aversion to Brussels sprouts throughout most of my life. And I've grown to like the little critters. Critters, they're not critters, but you know, fixed a certain way. But nonetheless, things can change, right? Conditioning can change. But there's no inherent pleasantness in Brussels sprouts. There's no inherent unpleasantness in Brussels sprouts. And the minds of anger, or aversion and anger and attachment and desire that get caught up in all of this are working with a fiction to begin with. That those qualities that they are reacting to are not inherent in the object. And then all of the exaggeration we do on top of that to make them even better and more delightful and delicious than what they really are, and to also make them more horrible and awful than what they really are. This is a whole nother layer of ignorance that's involved. But it's all rooted in this fundamental misconception, thinking that what I am perceiving, what I am experiencing, is inherent within the object. It's not. Or everyone would see it the exact same way. Everyone would like the same type of music. Everyone would dislike the same type of music, right? You wouldn't have a variation in people's tastes. And there is no, I mean, what's that phrase we have in our culture, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Yes, culturally, we've developed something that we refer to as what is a beautiful form for various human beings, what have you. But that still is subjective, highly subjective. You go to different cultures in this world, and you might see very different things being embraced as beautiful. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Ugliness is in the eye of the beholder. There's nothing inherently there that is beautiful or ugly. So this is the mechanism by which we get caught up in all of this fictitious stuff and the delusions arising from that ignorance. And of course, the deeper ignorance that is this grasping at me, at I, as if I really exist, is the central focal point of all of this because it's caught up with what do I need to satisfy that I? What are the pleasant things that I need to keep pulling into my life to get all this happiness? What are the things I need to push away to protect that I? And we're believing in an I that doesn't exist in the way that we think it does. It does exist, but it doesn't exist in this way that we think is real, again, in quotes, because there is reality. It's just reality is actually really quite subtle. So I just want to do a little bit of that. I know that you may have even encountered that in Module 9 when you talk about the delusions, the afflictions. They're arising always, again, rooted in ignorance. Ignorance about the I, that is kind of driving the show, but then ignorance about everything we experience. Thinking things have their own reality, that they exist in that concrete, solid, self-sufficient, substantial, objective way of existing by their own nature, by way of their own characteristics. Everything seems to have that. And this is what we're targeting in this whole thing. Let me go on then. I'm going to do a few slides on this that also come from the tail end of chapter 3, where His Holiness talks about why we need this understanding, why the truth is important. He says, when the roots of a tree are cut, this is what I mentioned, he uses the analogy that I've been using of the tree of samsara, all the branches, twigs, and leaves dry up. In the same way, all the problems of psychic existence are undermined by removing the misunderstanding that is their cause. Again, you may have heard these teachings before, but I just want to set the stage for what we're going to go into next in terms of this reasoning of dependent arising. Gradually, this awareness will weaken your misconceptions and diminish the trouble they cause. Since accepting appearances as truth is the basic problem, right? I've been talking about that, how things appear to be existing on their own, out there from their own side. The antidote, he says, is to come to realize the falsity of appearances through reasoning. Let me take it off screen for a moment here, because I do want to talk about this role of appearances. Remember earlier, just a short while ago, I was talking about how we have this ignorance and all the afflictions as the first obstacle we have to overcome. We have to stop our believing in these appearances. But where are these appearances coming from? The appearances are deceptive as well. They're a false overlay. The fact that birthday cake and the music and everything else that we experience in our lives seems to exist from its own side, seems to have its own entity that establishes what it is, seems to have that independent existence. That false appearance is actually something coming from our own minds. These very subtle imprints of this ignorance that have given rise to that false appearance. This is the last obstacle that the bodhisattva has to remove because it's what's keeping us kind of caught up in this world of illusion. Things appearing to exist in one way when they don't exist that way at all. This is a theme we're going to see in the remaining classes as well when we talk about kind of what does exist and what doesn't exist. Things appear in this fictitious way. The analogy that I frequently use when I talk about emptiness, because I find it to be so close in meaning, and it was one that the Buddha used frequently, was the analogy of a dream. I don't know your dreams, so I can't say that your dreams are like mine, but every time I talk to people about dreams, I get the feeling that their dreams are the same as in terms of what they go through is similar to what I go through. When I get into a really deep dreaming state, I'm totally convinced that what I'm experiencing is real. You know? Even though it can be really ridiculous, even though it can be, people who don't even exist anymore who come into your dream, right? Even though you can have a lot of things going on in your dream, rarely do you question the reality of your dream. It appears to be real. It appears to be as real as your waking life, right? And we buy into it in the face of our dream. While we are going through all the various things happening in the dream, we're totally caught up in it. We even have some of those same emotions that I was just talking about, the afflicted minds of attachment when the pleasant things come into our dreams, the mind of aversion and anger and fear when unpleasant things come into our dreams. We have these forces that are going on in our dreams. We're buying into our dream landscape in the same way that we are buying into our waking landscape, believing it to be real in the way that it appears. When we wake up from our dream, of course, then we go, oh, wow, that wasn't happening at all. We might even tell people, oh, I had a really strange dream last night or whatever. And we can all relate to each other, that experience of being totally caught up in something that you were convinced was real, but it wasn't real at all because you woke up and saw the lack of reality to it. Of course, we call Buddha the awakened one because of waking up to the reality that things don't exist in the way they appear. Things will continue to appear fictitious until we are kind of a Buddha, essentially. We will have moments where it does disappear, where that appearance is no longer something that is a factor. But nonetheless, until we get to the state of Buddhahood, we won't have removed those imprints that cause that false appearance. So when you think about this dream analogy, what we are caught up in samsara is not just our mistaken ideas through the ignorance that keeps putting out this thought that things are real from their own side, but the force of things actually having that appearance. So just like in our dream state, where if you don't have lucid dreaming and you don't have an ability to be aware that you're dreaming in any of your dreams, well, then you're totally buying into your dreams as real all the time and going through a whole lot of unnecessary emotion, right? Because what's the point of getting attached to dream objects when they aren't even objects that we can enjoy, really? It's just a dream experience that's over like that. Well, the Buddha says we're doing the same thing in our waking life. We are buying into everything as if it was real and putting so much energy and attention to this landscape of experiences that appears to be real, appears to be pleasant from its own side, unpleasant from its own side. We keep buying into all of this, and we're only compounding our suffering, we're only compounding our confusion and craziness. We need to wake up. We need to see that things don't exist in the way that they appear. If you were a lucid dreamer, going back to the dream analogy, and you were able to be in your dream state, and anytime something appeared, you were able to immediately refute it in terms of, oh, that's just a dream appearance. Appears to be real, but it's not real. I don't have to have any fear. I don't have to have any excitement. I don't have to have any of these emotions arising. That's what we're aiming for in our waking life, right? To not get so caught up in all of this stuff, because that's how we get in trouble. That mechanism I was explaining earlier, whenever we have that attachment, well, then frequently that leads to some non-virtuous action to get at that object of attachment and desire. Or we might have non-virtue arising too by pushing away things that are unpleasant in our lives. This is how we are in trouble. This is why we need these teachings and why we need to realize emptiness. So let's go back to the screen and go continue with this. So again, because accepting appearances as truth is the basic problem, His Holiness says, the antidote is to come to realize the falsity of appearances through reasoning, to see that the way things appear and the way they actually exist are not the same. In fact, they're contradictory. Okay. Then finally, he says, when ignorance is overcome, you will have uprooted the mistaken beliefs that superimpose on objects qualities, such as beauty and ugliness, beyond what they actually have. Then all other afflictive emotions, lust, hatred, jealousy, belligerence, and so on. There's lists of them from the Minds and Mental Factors study in Buddhism. They all have ignorance as their root. All of these are overcome. Because once you get rid of the root of ignorance, as we saw with the tree analogy, then nothing can arise within that ignorance. Now, again, our virtuous states of mind, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, still can arise because they actually are grounded in truth. They are actually grounded. The thought of compassion for other beings is grounded in truth. Because when we look at other sentient beings and see that they lack the the experience of freedom from suffering, that they continue to experience things that are unsatisfactory, that is a valid statement. And the valid response is to wish them to be free from that. There's complete validity within the positive emotions. But the negative emotions that are seeing a person as inherently horrible and evil and awful, and then doing something horrible to harm them, those states of mind are not grounded in validity. Because again, that's an exaggeration. That's choosing one aspect of a person and compounding the unpleasantness so that we then have a view of them that is not in accord with how they actually exist. So again, if we pick this all apart, we see that what's operating is our mind being totally deluded, totally caught up in fictitious ways of relating to the world around us and the experiences that we're having. So to conclude this, then, His Holiness goes on with that same analogy. Then, when afflictive emotions are removed, when the trunk of the tree, then they can no longer motivate your actions, again, that I was calling the branches of the tree, your karma. Then your powerless birth and rebirth in psychic existence driven by predispositions established by your actions, which is the other aspect of karma, those seeds that we planted, they're all overcome. You no longer will take rebirth through the force of your karma and delusions, and liberation is attained. So this is, again, how the Buddha framed what we're looking at and what we're trying to develop in terms of our understanding throughout this course, not just tonight, by looking at this reasoning of dependent arising. So let's go on to talk a little bit about this reasoning and its importance. I might mention before we go into this that Venerable Thupten Chodron, many of you know her name, wonderful nun in our same tradition as us, and was a student of Lama Yeshe's and Lama Zopa's. She now has her own organization up in Washington State, Sravasti Abbey. She talks about how if we are going to talk to anybody about emptiness, this very difficult concept to get our heads around, dependent arising is the best way to approach it. And why is that? It's because dependent arising is working from the point of view of looking at how things actually do exist. This is because, as we're going to see when we go into this investigation, one of the difficulties we can have when we start analyzing in this way and start playing with this concept of emptiness is suddenly falling into this kind of extreme of thinking things don't exist at all. Emptiness does not mean nothingness. There's one little section of His Holiness's book that kind of goes into this. Nothingness would mean nothing exists at all. What we are trying to refute is a fictitious way of existing. Go to the dream analogy once more. When you are refuting that your dream objects are real, in quotes, you mean that they are not as real, they're real in the same way that your waking objects are real, right? So if you have a dream about some person in your life, that's very different and a different experience than if you actually meet with that person in your waking life, right? The dream object and the waking object are not in the same kind of sphere of reality. Dream objects don't have the status of reality that waking objects do. Yeah, but you are never denying that dream objects exist at all, right? You never deny that. Dream objects do exist. They do still appear, and we can still identify, oh, that's the person I know in my dream, appearing as a dream object. Not the real person, because I know that from my waking up. So we never really refute that dream objects themselves exist. We refute their way of existing. They don't exist in the same manner as waking objects. With emptiness, it's the exact same thing. These reasonings that we're going to get into tonight and next week are a way of undermining a layer of existence that we are putting on things. Things do exist. We're just putting on a layer that is fictitious. But how do they exist? The reasoning of dependent arising gives us that. And by virtue of that, it helps us not to fall into this extreme of thinking things don't exist at all. This is what I'm going to talk about a little later when we talk about these two extreme views, because there is that danger. When we begin to analyze, suddenly things don't seem so real and concrete anymore. We think, oh my gosh, what am I working with here? Does that mean this is all a dream and I just, it's all fiction at the deepest level and there's no reality, there's no karma, there's no rebirth, there's no me, there's no you, there's no anything? The Buddha never said it to mean that. He might use phrases like we see in the Heart Sutra, right, where we see no form, no feeling, no discrimination, and so on. I'm going to talk a little bit later about what the no means there, but it's essentially negating that there is no inherent existence, intrinsic existence, existence from its own side, all these ways that we've been talking about, not that there's no mere existence. Mere existence exists. Things do exist. You're here, sitting here tonight, listening to these teachings. You exist. But how do you exist? So when we get into the reasoning on dependent arising, it's a very powerful way to help us not to fall into that extreme, to think that the teachings on emptiness are teaching us nothingness, that things don't have any existence at all. I mean, it sounds pretty dismal if that were the case, right? I don't think that's what we would want to attribute to any uh, philosophy or spiritual tradition. In fact, people who hear about Buddhism and think that because we teach things like emptiness or voidness, that somehow we're negating that things have any existence at all. We're not. We're just negating how do they exist. And again, as we go into this teaching on dependent arising, really keep in mind this concept of independent existence as being what we're refuting. Things existing independently, on their own, by way of their own nature, established from their own side, having that kind of independent existence. Because as we can see in this phrase, we're going to assert that things actually have a dependent way of arising, a dependent existence. So let's take a short break, because before I get into this, I know once I start going on this, I'm going to want to continue. I'm just kind of put the toe in the water here. We're just letting you know what we're going to be talking about for the remaining time tonight. Let's take about a 5-minute break. Okay. I hope you had a nice little break. Give yourself a chance just to stretch a bit. So let's talk about dependent arising. First, I want to introduce this reasoning as what is frequently called the king of reasonings. Of course, they use king because kings have, in our traditional culture, more power than queens. But this, of course, comes from a patriarchal model, so don't get too caught up in all of that. But it's the king of reasonings, meaning that it's the supreme reasoning. And it's kind of because of what I just mentioned, that if we really understand how things exist, we get the fact that they lack this independent way of existing. And it also doesn't allow us to fall into the extreme of thinking things don't exist at all, because we're continually talking about things that do exist. We're just getting at how do they exist. So there are 3 levels of dependent arising that are traditionally taught. And I'm going to introduce these to you by way of some teachings that come from another book by His Holiness. I like the fact that His Holiness deals with these, but he doesn't deal with them in as clear a way of kind of saying 1, 2, 3. Because there are 3 levels of dependent arising. And so it's important that we understand kind of how these are presented. This is the summary of them. The first one being dependence upon causes and conditions. And I'll talk about those in a moment, what those all entail. But you'll notice a little footnote to that only pertains to what the Buddha called impermanent phenomena. Impermanent and permanent are the 2 categories of phenomena. There are some phenomena that actually are permanent, but permanent and impermanent here don't mean what we think of in our culture necessarily. Impermanent means changing momentarily, meaning that things have a nature of changing each moment by virtue of the fact that they are arising from various factors. Most of what we experience in the world is something that is impermanent. all those objects of our senses, music. If music was permanent, meaning unchanging, not changing moment by moment, then you'd only keep hearing the same note for forever, right? That note would just continue on and on and on and on. It changes. That's the beauty of music, right? That music changes, that they add in different instruments and different notes and whatever is unfolding. And we see this whole process. Impermanence has its grace, but of course, most beings have a resistance to impermanence too, because they'd like to find things that they can rely upon. And impermanent phenomena are changing all the time. But anyway, we're going to get into this reasoning. The first level is really pointing to all of those phenomena that have that quality of changing momentarily. Again, the Buddha said that there are those kind of phenomena, but then there are even some things that are permanent, and they're not meaning eternal, but meaning that they don't change moment by moment while they are existing. And maybe I'll talk a little later about that to give you some clue about what permanent phenomena are. The second level of dependence is dependence upon parts. This gets a little bit subtler than causes and conditions, as we'll see. But the third one is the subtlest, and that's the dependence upon conceptuality. I mentioned earlier when we were talking about that false way of thinking, seeing things as not relying upon consciousness, not involved with our consciousness. This third level is saying that your consciousness, in fact, your conceptual mind, is involved in imputing, designating, labeling, bringing things into existence from the side of that consciousness as opposed to from the side of the object. In other words, a more subjective element involved in how things exist. So let's look at what His Holiness says in this book called Ethics for the New Millennium. I brought this in tonight if anyone needed to look at it, but there's a wonderful teaching in that book. Even though this is a more secular book, it was intended to be when His Holiness wrote it. But he says, as a means to understanding this complexity of kind of how things exist and don't, he says, I find the concept of dependent origination, dependent arising, dependent relativity, I've even heard it called. The Tibetan, as he says there, is tendral. Tendral is articulated by the Madhyamika middle way school of Buddhist philosophy. That's particularly helpful in coming to understand how things exist. And keep in mind that middle way. We've talked about how the school we're studying is the middle way, the Madhyamika view. And that comes into play when we get to talking about these two extreme views. According to this, His Holiness says we can understand how things and events come to be in three different ways, or three different levels, even, is a helpful way to think about it. At the first level, principle of cause and effect, whereby all things and events arise in dependence on a complex web of interrelated causes and conditions, is invoked. This suggests that no thing or event, these are impermanent things, things that change momentarily, can be construed as capable of coming into or remaining in existence by itself. Remember, the false way we were thinking is things are self-sufficient. Things actually depend upon other things, or by way of its own power, we said is the false way. Things don't have their own power. They depend upon many other things. For example, he says, if I take some clay and mold it, I can bring a pot into being. The pot exists as an effect of my actions, right? Maybe some of you have dabbled in pottery and gone to a pottery class where you take the clay and mold it, maybe even on a wheel and with water and what have you. You bring a pot into existence from the clay, right? You're a major element involved in that. At the same time, the pot is also the effect of a myriad of other causes and conditions, right? These include the combination of clay and water to form its raw material. Beyond this, we can point to the coming together of the molecules, atoms, and other minute particles which form these constituents, which are themselves dependent on innumerable other factors. Then there are the circumstances leading up to my decision to make a pot. Why am I making a pot? There must have been some thought process that was a cause also to me getting my hands in the clay and molding the pot. And there are the cooperative conditions of my actions as I give shape to the clay. All of these different factors make it clear that my pot cannot come into existence independently of its causes and conditions. Rather, it is dependently originated. It's kind of interesting if you think about this. There was one, I think Carl Sagan once said, if you really want to make a cake from scratch, you have to invent the whole universe. And if you think about that, it's really true, right? If you really say, what does it mean from scratch? Well, but I mean, even that goes beyond that because you'd have to invent whatever came before the universe, right? Because His Holiness even points that out to scientists. Well, no problem with the Big Bang, but what came before the Big Bang? There's always something else that preceded things. If we talk about the world of causes and conditions, there are infinite causes and conditions in that pot or in the eye, or in whatever phenomenon it is that we're turning our attention to that is in this category of something that arises from causes and conditions. But we're going to, kind of stick within like kind of the contemporaneous stuff, not talk about, what preceded that in history and the whole formation of this planet and the formation of the solar system and all this. All those are obviously all involved in the things that we experience. But we can see that those things, therefore, regardless of what level we go to, those things that are coexistent with it or just prior to it, versus the things that are way back in time that preceded it, that nothing exists independent of those causes and conditions. But yet, when we see something, for example, the book, like the book by His Holiness, it seems to have its own bookness that isn't dependent upon all those causes and conditions. We can think about them and analyze and see all of that. But nonetheless, the appearance is that it's kind of established here at this point in time with this identity, with this particular appearance. Doesn't have that it doesn't evoke all of that depth of meaning of the myriad causes and conditions that led to the appearance of this phenomenon that I'm holding in my hand, right? So everything that is caused in this way, we see lacks any independent existence by virtue of that. And what's interesting for this middle way school that we're studying, they say that actually is even enough right there to prove emptiness. And let's hold on to that thought because it is important to go deeper in terms of how does the book exist in terms of its parts and dependence upon those, dependence upon imputation, this subtlest level that I mentioned. So let's go on with what His Holiness talks about in terms of the next level. On the second level, tendril can be understood in terms of the mutual dependence which exists between parts and whole. Without parts, there can be no whole. Without a whole, the concept of parts makes no sense. The idea of whole is predicated on parts. But yet, these parts themselves must be considered to be wholes comprised of their own parts, right? This is getting at that kind of idea of you never find when you kind of peel an onion, you never get the sort of substantial core at the center of it, right? Well, let's look at the book, for example. We know that there are many parts to a book. A hardbound book like this, it has, of course, the jacket, the paper jacket that goes around it, and it has the kind of harder part of the hardbound part of it that is the cover, the back cover, the front cover, the spine. Then you have each of the individual pages. In this case, besides the few pages that are blank, you have 257 pages. You have all of the words that are on the pages. Those are parts of it as well, the parts of the words, and so on. Is there a book that exists independent of all these parts? If I were to take these parts away, you couldn't find some sort of independently existing book. Nonetheless, we still think that there's some sort of whole book here in my hand that kind of owns all these parts, or that is the sum of all these parts, if we want to use that phrase. But the whole completely depends upon the parts. And every part, as His Holiness points out, within the parts of the book also have their own wholeness that depend upon their own parts. As was mentioned earlier, I mean, if you go down to a microscopic level and atomic particles and subatomic particles and all these things that scientists are trying to find in the physical world, you never find any sort of thing that's able to be identified as being without any parts, right? Every whole that we identify, whether it's a page of a book or a quark or a subquark or whatever they're down to in terms of these various small elements of our physical world, they never get to something that's sort of partless, that has its own ability to stand up on its own. Everything depends upon its parts. And this is true even for things that are not arising from causes and conditions in the impermanent world. And I'll talk about permanent phenomena at another time, not tonight. But let's just work with the impermanent phenomena. That's good enough because that's most of what we experience, again, are the books and the food that we eat and the various things that we interact with. And of course, the I, the big one. We too are dependent upon our parts. What are the parts of an I? We got the physical parts, the body, right? And we got the mental parts, our mind and all the various mental states. This is what the Buddha refers to as the five aggregates. You'll come across this phrase in some of your readings. And of course, in the Heart Sutra, when we recite the five aggregates. There's no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness. The first one, form, is our physical body. There's no form that exists on its own, independent, doesn't exist inherently. Neither do the four mental components that the Buddha broke out for various reasons. We won't talk about them tonight. But essentially, we have the feeling component, meaning how we are registering something that is pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. We have the discrimination, which means that we think, oh, this is good and this is bad, and all the things that come up with our discriminating this from that. We have the other compositional factors, all the various other things in the landscape of our mind. And we have the consciousness itself that all of those are arising in, our general state of awareness that can be directed as a sense consciousness or a mental consciousness. So all four of those we're going to lump together. We're going to talk about them as mind and body, form, and then the other four aggregates. So essentially we have those two main parts. But those parts have parts too, right? We talk about the form, this body, and actually this is your meditation to do for the next week. Is a wonderful meditation that Venerable Rabina put together for a book called Spiritual Friends many years ago. And it's meditating on the body, this form that we are involved with from conception till death, right? From the womb to the tomb. This is what we are working with, is this physical body that we have a lot of attachment towards and a lot of identification of this as being the self. We'll talk more about that later. This is the analysis. This is to go, well, where first the causes and conditions involved in this, the first level that we already talked about. Look at all the causes and conditions involved in sustaining a body. And we think our bodies have some sort of unchanging identity, but they're changing all the time. Remember learning that many years ago in school, right? That over the course of 7 years, by the time you get through 7 years, every single cell in your body has been replaced at least once, right? You have a whole new body than you did 7 years ago with regard to every single cell of your body. Well, there's nothing really kind of independently, inherently existing there then. We're just simply putting a label on this whole collection of stuff that's continually changing. But let's look at the parts of the body. You get to the main parts. You've got your head and your torso and your limbs. And then you kind of go into any one of those. So go to the head. You've got many parts to the head. You've got the eyes and the nose and the mouth and the ears and so on. And then you go to an eye and you see that there are many parts to the eye. You've got the iris and the pupil and the cornea and all these. And you go to any one of those and you can pick parts of that. You kind of keep going and you see that each one has its own sort of wholeness, which is, again, how we identify it. But then within it, there are parts that it depends upon. Without those parts, we couldn't have the whole. And the whole, in a sense, is also dependent, or the parts are also dependent upon the whole because we think of the parts as being part of that whole. The parts of the eye, the parts of the head, the parts of the body. This is, again, how we are working with everything in our world. This isn't maybe too difficult to see, but yet we think things have some sort of autonomous, independent identity. That there's still a wholeness that we grasp at as being real. Well, where is the book that these parts that I pointed out are part of? And you say, well, it's in your hand. But where is it within my hand? Is the book actually the cover of the book, the dust jacket of the book? Is it the pages of the book? Is it any particular page of the book? We see that this relationship of parts and whole belies our clinging to some sort of wholeness that has some independent existence separate from its parts. Same with the body, right? Where is the whole body? The whole body you might, again, point to in a conventional sense and say, oh, it's right there. There's my body. But where's the real body? Start trying to pick it apart and find it. Do you find a real body existing independent of your parts? No. Once you start isolating those parts, you see that those parts kind of have an identity as the head, the torso, the limbs, what have you. And you don't see the body anymore. You see those parts of the body. Where did the whole body go to? You know, this is the process of kind of working with that second level, is to see that everything that exists has parts. The whole is how we are referring to it in terms of some level of things at a particular stage. Yeah. Because again, our bodies weren't always like this, and our bodies changed, especially in the womb, right? My gosh, we start off as two little cells that come together in our mother's womb. And would you think of that as the body? Well, it's very different from what it looks like now, right? Those two little cells that have just united at that moment of conception, and so on, this whole process. So again, Venerable Robina's meditation gets you into that idea of the causes and conditions, and I think she even goes into the parts, but it's to get you kind of to loosen up some of the ways that we think about things. But if we start analyzing, we can get to this third level pretty easily from the second level, though it is a bit of a jump. Let's look at what His Holiness says on the third level and then talk about it a bit. On the third level, all phenomena can be understood to be dependently originated because when we analyze them, we find that ultimately they lack independent identity. What we identify them as even isn't from the side of the object, it's from the side of the subject. He says this can be understood in one way from the way in which we refer to certain phenomena. This is kind of this one thing that His Holiness throws in sometimes. It's generally not how we think of this third level exclusively, but it is an example. He says, for example, the words action and agent, such as uh, uh, a flyer and flying, or a driver and driving, right? These sorts of interdependent concepts, they presuppose one another. Somebody can't be driving without them being a driver. You can't be talking without you being a talker, right? These do depend upon each other, the agent and the action. So do parent and child, right? Can you have a parent without there having been posited a child? I mean, and I'm not saying the child has to be there forever. Children do die, but you still might call them a parent, a father, a mother, what have you, who had a child. But we designate parent on the basis of someone who has a child. We designate child on the basis of being the offspring of a parent, right? Someone is a parent only because he or she has children, His Holiness says. Likewise, a daughter or a son is so called only in relation to them having parents. The same relationship of mutual dependence is seen in the language we use to describe trades or professions, even. Individuals are called farmers on account of their work on the land. Doctors are so called because of their work in the field of medicine, right? Teachers are called because they teach, students because they study. I mean, we have this interdependent way of talking about things that is starting to get us in the neighborhood of how things are conceptually gotten to. By virtue of our conceptual minds, we're able to frame these sorts of things and think of beings and things in our world in particular ways, but in a more subtle way. And again, this is the way that we generally talk about this. I wanted to keep His Holiness's whole thing in there, but it still fits into the same category, again, about how our conceptual consciousness is involved. He says here, in a more subtle way, things and events can be understood in terms of dependent origination when, for example, we ask, what exactly is a clay pot? Or what exactly is a book? When we look for something we can describe as its final identity, we find that the pot's very existence, and by implication that of all other phenomena, is to some extent provisional and determined merely by convention. this is what we're getting into in that last category, is that we decide what is book, what is clay pot, what is chair, what is blue, what is red. It's a subjective designation given to those bases for those labels, for that imputation. His Holiness continues, when we ask whether its identity is determined by its shape, function, its specific parts, that is, being compounded of clay, water, and so on, we find that the term pot is merely a verbal designation. There's no single characteristic which can be said to identify it, nor indeed does the totality of its characteristics. Again, the whole doesn't designate it completely. We can imagine pots of different shapes that are no less pots, right? When I say the word pot, I mean, I've been doing this without a physical pot here, right? I don't have a clay pot in my hand. You all might have a very different image of what that clay pot looks like. You know, how wide, bulbous it is, you know, what size, the opening, what have you, all these various features of a clay pot that are nonetheless all pots. And this is how our conceptual mind works in sort of designating things. But we all come to some conventional agreement to call that flat bottom bulbous thing with an opening a pot. All right. And because we can only really speak of its existing in relation to a complex nexus of causes and conditions, viewed from this perspective, it has no, because there are many factors involved in its arising. In other words, it does not exist in and of itself, but rather is dependently originated. Let me stop here and it's a little bit from Rinpoche on this. Let's go back to the book. Again, as soon as I hold this up, let's look at the appearance factor for just a moment. It seems to have its own bookness right here in my hand, right? And we all are familiar with these objects. We all have many books that we own and that we've read and so on throughout our lives. We learned what a book was at some point, and these books seem to have their own bookness. Let's talk about again how this book arises in this third way. We already talked about, well, we didn't really talk about causes and conditions, but I think that's pretty clear in terms of using the pot as the analogy. The causes and conditions for a book are obviously the wood pulp, that it was the main substance of the book for most of it. I mean, you know, the glue and the spine is not made from the same substance, but to get pages and to get the cover and a lot of the things involved in this, you probably had to use that as the main substantial cause. But then you have a whole lot of other causes and conditions in creating it, right? So there is no book that exists independent of those causes and conditions. We also examined just a little while ago how there's no book that exists independent of its parts. Let's talk about this last level. Its dependence upon our conceptual designation of this as book. And we're not talking about mere language, though language is often involved in it, frequently involved in it, because you can still have a conceptual idea of something before you even know the name of it, right? And this happens in infancy, right? When you don't know words as an infant, you're not coming out of the womb with a full vocabulary. You've got to actually learn what everything is. I was alluding to this a bit earlier. Well, when you're still prelingual, when you're not talking and engaging in language with other people, you still have a concept of what mother's milk is, for example, a big part of most babies' lives when they're nursing and so on. You have an idea of even, you know, from seeing the face of your mother. I think there's a certain age where you begin to recognize and have that familiarity, where you are thinking of that, but you don't think, oh, that's my mother, right? You don't have that concept, that label, but you have a conceptual idea. Most of what we do get caught up in is labeling linguistically through coming up with the language. And of course, we have many different languages in this world. Each of them has a different idea for what, or a different concept or term for what this is in my hand. In French, it's un livre, right? And in Italian, un libro. And Spanish, is it the same? Libro? Libro? Yeah. And of course, English, we use book. And, you know, we could go through all the different languages, but they are all a term, a designation that they are giving to this basis that's in my hand. This basis doesn't have any bookness from its own side, as His Holiness was pointing out. And what's the proof of that? Well, as soon as we saw this when we were young and learning it, we would have gotten the name of it. The bookness would have been evident to us. The bookness, if it was established out here on this basis. would already be known to us. We wouldn't have to learn the label. We're going to go into this in a moment. And Rinpoche's way of approaching this was part of one of the readings assigned from last week for this week. But this idea that we learn what things are designated, but they nonetheless appear as if they have that identity from their own side. Once we learn that, it kind of absorbs into it and seems to be a book from its own side, have its own bookness. But if we investigate, we see that again, there's no book on any of the parts of the book. We already examined that to some degree, right? With that second level, where's the whole book? Does it exist as any of the parts? Doesn't seem to. Where does book come from? If I take all the parts of a book and isolate them and set them aside, well, then is there some sort of bookness that exists independent of those? No, book is a designation given to this collection of stuff. In English language, we all agree to call this a book. If you went into a bookstore and you said, "Oh, do you have any, sponges?" And they'd say, "Well, what are you talking about? This is a bookstore." And a sponge, that thing that you open up and you read, and it's like, no, you've got the wrong term. We agree conventionally to call this a book. So we can organize our world in a way that makes sense, that we can actually operate in the world and talk about things and relate to each other, right? That's a conventional way that we are doing things. Yet, as I was pointing out earlier when we were talking about this ignorance that what we are adhering to, that's not how we actually think of things. We think that they are already existing out there on their own, and we're simply discovering what they are. And that, again, is how we are taught. I don't remember when I first learned book. I'm sure it was a children's book, right? I wasn't, reading His Holiness the Dalai Lama's books when I was an infant or something. But we learned this concept of book. We were taught the label for a basis of labeling that was proper, that fit with it. I'm thankful that my parents taught me all the correct labels, right? We're all thankful because then we can relate to things in the world with other people. But we again make that mistake in thinking that it's got some bookness from its own side, that the bookness is established out here and not merely through my own consciousness, my conceptual mind designating this as book, giving it its identity. Now, what is on the side of the basis? Again, just a collection of parts, causes, and conditions that we are calling a basis for imputing book. And in this case, it happens to be the correct basis of designation. And if I held up this wrist mala and I started calling this book, then we'd have problems. But we learn what things are, we give them that designation, and new things come into our world all the time, right? When I was growing up, there weren't, computers, there weren't certainly cell phones and iPads and all these various things. All of our culture keeps developing more and more things that get a label. Everything that we learn of what it is, it appears to us as if that designation is from the side of the basis, as opposed to coming from the side of the subjective awareness that is knowing that. Specifically, our conceptual mind that is continually organizing our world. There's no organization from the side of anything out here. It's just a conglomeration of all these various causes and conditions coming together to produce the various bases that we then designate as those phenomena. So you'll note that there's never any place in any of this discussion of these three levels of dependent arising where we negated that things exist at all, right? I've never said there's no book. I've never said, that there's no clay pot. His Holiness has never refuted mere existence. We just say, how do things exist? We have this basis for book, and then we have the label book that we give to this. Jeffrey Hopkins, in one of his books, Emptiness Yoga, he says, if we don't kind of get at a really deep level that the label book and what I have in my hand are actually two different phenomena, then we're not really getting it. He says, if you get that like that kind of hits you in a really profound way, then you're kind of, again, grokking it, you're getting it, you're kind of developing a deeper understanding of this. The label book and what I have in my hand are actually two different phenomena. Interrelated, right? Book is the label I give to this through my designating consciousness, my labeling consciousness. And this is the basis we've agreed to call book. There's no real book in my hand, folks. I don't have a real book in my hand. I have the parts that we label as book, but bookness is coming from the side of our subjective awareness. It's not coming from the side of this stuff. Now, again, it has its own individual parts that we've also labeled. We've labeled the spine and the front cover and the back cover and the dust jacket and the pages and da 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 da. And all of those, a similar analysis would not find that they would find the same thing, that they don't exist from their own side, that they are merely labeled. What we call a page is a label given to a sheet of paper that goes inside of a book that usually has writing, pictures, whatever on it. Okay, right? And that's it. There's no real pages in this book. And I'm calling it a book because it's worthy of being called a book, but it's only called a book. It doesn't have any bookness from its own side. The pages don't have any pageness from their own side. Redness doesn't have any red from its own side. Blueness, any blue from its own side. These are all designations that we give to things. So let's talk a little bit about this process. I think that's what's next on my little slides here. Some of these I was even putting together today as I do this every time I teach Discovering Buddhism. I sometimes just kind of refine what I'm going through. His Holiness, I'm sorry, this is Rinpoche, Lama Zopa Rinpoche. This is one of the readings on page 75 of this nice little book, Virtue and Reality. That's one of the free publications of Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive. I think there actually are some here. I did see some here at the center, and the other one too, How Things Exist, the other one that's on your list. But this is in this one chapter that's really quite nice. And he was using a bell. As Rinpoche was teaching, he was using a bell, probably one of the ritual bells that we use in Tantra. He says, so what is this bell or any other object you care to look at? It is nothing other than that which is merely labeled by the mind. But our minds are so replete with negative imprints left by past ignorance, the simultaneously born concept of inherent existence, that even though things exist as merely labeled by the mind, we hold on to them as if they exist from their own side. This is why we need these reasonings and to remind ourselves continually of how things actually exist. And the dependent arising points out the levels of how we can think of things existing, which in the subtlemost way is as merely imputed. Merely means nothing more substantial than that. And I pointed out there's nothing, let me do it again, nothing from the side of this that's in my hand that is a book. Book is a label that I give to that, a designation I make to that we conventionally have agreed upon. In another language, it would sound differently, but it's their way of referring to this basis. Now, there's a validity to this basis again, because as I pointed out, you couldn't just call anything a book. It's what we have conventionally agreed to call book. But it's got no bookness from its own side, folks. It just doesn't, it can't. Otherwise, where is it? Find it. Point it out to me. If there was this unitary phenomenon, because this is how we are doing pretty much everything we designate. It's got a unitary identity. I tried to think about this for a while because I mentioned that in one class, and one person asked, is that true that everything has a unitary identity? But at some level, even if we talk about mountains, like the mountains, the Sangre de Cristo mountains that we see here in Santa Fe, we still see it as somewhat unitary, right? This mountain range, that we think of as the Sangre de Cristo mountains. There's a sense of unitariness. Well, this appears to have a unitariness, right, as a single book, but it's actually got multiplicity to it, as we pointed out when we looked at the parts, right? All the various things that compose the book at a grosser level as well as at a subtler level where we find infinite parts. So what is correct, the multiplicity or the singularity? The singularities by nature don't exist as an kind of able to support themselves because everything is based on parts, temporal parts, spatial parts. Everything has parts. Okay, so let's go back to what Rinpoche was saying, because he points out a very important process that's involved in how we get in trouble as well. I was talking earlier about how we get in trouble, but I'm sorry. No, that was the same one, right? So he says, we apprehend them as inherently existent, as not merely imputed by the mind. Then he goes on, and this is what I'm really wanting to point out in this part of my lecture tonight. Basically, there are three things in the evolution of all this. First of all, as a start, our mind merely labels the object, right? So again, we go back to the book. When we were young and we learned the label for something that is book, there's many different books, right? I mean, when I said I was reading children's books when I was young, I didn't read, War and Peace. That was not in my library at the time, right? So we have these things called books that we learn the label for. There's a basis that appears, which is generally something with covers and pages. Again, something on the pages, writing, pictures, photographs, whatever. And we learn the proper label for it. And if we stopped there, we'd all be fine. I hate to say it, but that's I think the truth. If we just simply saw things as merely labeled, that's what we have to get to, is seeing that that is all that's involved in how things exist, is through mere designation on a basis which consists of its parts, which arises from causes and conditions. All of it's wrapped up in it's having no independent concrete identity, simply designated as what we choose to designate it as conventionally. Again, I can't start calling things all sorts of things that no one else wants to call them, because then there's no conventional agreement. Then I'll be referring to this as, a sponge, and everyone else will be going, what are you talking about? That's not a sponge. This is the basis for a sponge. And they show me that, and I go, no, that's a book. Well, then I'm kind of just totally crazy at that point, because I'm going against convention. Convention does agree with on certain things to be called certain labels and to be thought of in a particular way. Second, the second step, the negative imprints left by previous concepts of inherent existence project the appearance of inherent existence, that the object we're looking at now exists from its own side, that there's a real bell there or a real book there. Not a bell from our mind, but a bell from the side of the bell, or you might even say from the side of the basis for the bell. This is a totally, totally wrong idea. A complete hallucination projected onto the bell or onto the book. So remember, I pointed that out to you earlier when we were talking about this false appearance. As soon as I lift this book, see, I'm calling it a book. That's how we think of it conventionally. There's nothing wrong with saying the merely imputed book. But as soon as I lift this up and show it to you, it seems to have its own bookness, right? That's a false appearance. That's arising within our own minds. It's not out here on the object either. It's a mistaken way that things appear through the force of our having had these imprints of ignorance since beginningless time. In Buddhism, we talk a lot about beginningless time. Oh, something went off here. Sorry. The screen isn't working here. They're going to work on that while I continue to talk. So again, there is this false appearance that is arising from these imprints that is a part of the equation of why our ignorance is operative. If things were merely appearing as merely labeled, if they didn't seem to exist from their own side, then we wouldn't believe in it at all. But this third step that Rinpoche is going to point out is that we then believe in that false appearance. It's the same as going back to the dream analogy, right? A dream object appears to you in your dream. It appears to be real. It's got realness all over it. And you believe in that reality. And that's why in your dream, you can have all kinds of emotions coming up again, of fear and lust and whatever else goes on in your dreams. All the various range of emotions that we have in our waking life, they arise in our dream. I think we've got it back here. Let me go ahead and share that final step that Rinpoche talks about. Third, we allow our mind to believe that this is 100% true. We allow our mind to hold on to this, to grasp this as completely 100% true, that there's a real bell over there, that that's the reality. Again, going back to the book. First thing, we learn the label for book, we merely designate it. Like I said, if we stopped there, we wouldn't have a problem. But through the force of our ignorance in the past, these imprints make it seem like there's a real book here. Like the bookness is out here, established on this base that I'm holding in my hand. And then we assent to it, we agree to it. And of course, we just continue doing this in our lives. We never learn a new label. We just continue to relate to everything in our lives as if it was established from its own side, on its own, by way of its own characteristics, its own nature. Okay. So I wanted to point out that process because I think it's really effective at helping us to understand where our problem arises. If we were able to see things through the lens of that third level of dependent origination as merely imputed, then their false appearance would be totally contradicted because things actually have a nature of depending upon other factors, not just being merely imputed, though again, that's the very subtle way that we need to realize in order to get this profound middle way view. But even their reliance upon parts, even their reliance upon causes and conditions, all of these speak to the fact that things cannot exist in the way they appear. When we come to understand how things are real in this dependent manner, and I can call that a level of reality, we see that they're not real in the way that we've been thinking they're real. This false way of thinking about the real I, the real chair, the real book, the real friend, the real enemy, the real cake, the real whatever. We think it has that reality from its own side. Again, we're never negating existence in and of itself. We're only negating this false sense of reality that we are projecting on things. So again, His Holiness goes into a little bit more on this. You can read those chapters if you haven't already. They're really quite informative. Those are mostly chapters 4 and 5, where he goes into dependent arising. Let's go on to the next topic. Whoops, I'm sorry, there was one more thing. Oh, this was the end of that part. So he was talking about that third moment, right, where we believe in that, we have that conviction. He says, this is ignorance. At that moment, we are making our mind ignorant, unknowing. We are making our mind ignorant as to the actual nature of the bell, the book, and so on, which in reality is totally empty from its own side of that false way of existing, that false appearance. What exists is merely labeled by the mind. The bell, which is totally empty from its own side, exists merely in name, merely in designation, labeling, conceptualizing. Being unaware of this is an example of how we make our mind ignorant. So again, you can read the whole article and the virtue and reality that comes from. Again, it was on your reading list for last week in preparation for tonight. Let's go on to the third one, using that reasoning to overcome what are called the two extreme views. Let me introduce you to these views, and then we'll go into how His Holiness talks about these. And I think it's pretty easy to see these once we have gone through what we did in terms of dependent arising. And we just need to talk about how that's effective in overcoming these. First, the view, it's often called the view of eternalism, that holds to the extreme of existence or permanence, maybe permanence there meaning something having a sort of lasting identity, an unchanging identity, which adheres to the inherent existence of persons and phenomena. The view of nihilism, on the other hand, holds to the extreme of non-existence or annihilation, which negates the mere existence of persons and phenomena. So let's talk about these two extremes, because this is getting at the import of what we call, again, the middle way. The middle way view that we are trying to generate, that is very effectively generated through the reasoning of dependent arising, is that things don't fall into either of these extremes. Right now, we're in this extreme of thinking things exist intrinsically, inherently, from their own side, by way of their own characteristics, their own nature, and so on. We think things are set up on their own, objectively, without us even being involved. And we fall into that because that's where we've always been. Now, again, you could ask the question, well, how did we get there? It's an irrelevant question. That's where we are. That's just the way things are. We've always had this ignorance that has propelled us into that view, that eternalistic view, holding on to things as if there's some sort of intrinsic identity. Things have that from their own side. And even if we don't do the reasoning properly, we might still be over in that extreme. We moved away from that extreme through examining, especially the reasoning of dependent arising, which says, hey, folks, things don't exist in that way. They don't exist in some sort of intrinsic, in an inherent way. But when we kind of start engaging in that, we may fall into the other extreme, the extreme of non-existence, where we are going to hold this view that things are not existent at all, this nihilistic view. We're going to take the reasoning of dependent arising or any other reasoning and take it too far into meaning that it refutes mere existence. As I mentioned earlier, it never does. At no point in any of the analysis did we say that the book or the chair or the pot or the person or whatever exists at all. We never said that. It's just how do they exist? They exist as dependent arisings, dependent origination. So dependent arising actually is very effective in overcoming both extremes. And even the two words that we have are very effective right in and of themselves. If we think of this extreme as independent existence, right? We believe that things have this independent way of existing apart from everything else on their own. Well, then the word dependent says this can't possibly exist, then, right? This is a dichotomy, His Holiness points out, right? A dichotomy means something has to be one or the other. It can't be both. If we have a belief that things have an independent existence, then if we prove that things actually are dependent, they cannot be independent, right? Does it make sense? I mean, again, this is just basics of logic and reasoning that we may have learned in philosophy or wherever many moons ago. That if something can be proved to be non-existent, then there's no way it can exist. If we prove that it exists, then there's no way it's non-existent. It's a similar type of thing. If we prove that things are dependent upon other factors, they cannot be independent. So that's how we refute that extreme over there. The second word, arising, actually keeps us from falling into this nihilistic bent, right? Because things still arise. Books arise, chairs arise, pots arise, people arise, everything arises. And that means it's not utterly non existent. It's not a dependent nothing, it's a dependent something, it's a dependent arising. So these two words, in and of themselves, are already shutting the doors to both of those extremes. The problem with these extremes is that, again, if we fall into them, we've been over in this extreme since beginningless time. If we continue to fall in this, we're never going to hit the target and remove this ignorance that is grasping at reality in a fictitious way. But if we fall into the nihilistic bent, well, then we could abandon everything. We could abandon the laws of karma. We could abandon everything else the Buddha taught, thinking it doesn't matter because nothing exists anyway. And you probably don't get into a nihilistic bent without being exposed to either this type of reasoning or some other reasonings that, we do have nihilistic philosophies even in the West, right? But something that really gets to a point of negating what we can actually establish quite easily as being existing. Things do exist. You do exist. You just don't exist independently. You exist as an arising on the basis of various factors, as we already went through. So let's look quickly at what His Holiness says on this, and then we may have a little time to finish up the last part. These two extremes, His Holiness says, this is the pages in your book that you're reading, the exaggerated notion, I've inserted the numbers there, the exaggerated notion that phenomena exist under their own power. That's the extreme to the one side, right, of existence, this eternalism, and the denial of cause and effect, or of any sort of existence of various factors that do exist, are like chasms into which our mind can fall, creating damaging perspectives that either exaggerate the status of objects beyond their actual nature, as we've been doing since beginningless time, or deny the very existence of things such as cause and effect, in grosser ways as well as the subtler ways of karma and so on. We don't want to negate what actually does exist, but we do have to negate what doesn't exist, is what it comes down to. And that's the middle way. Falling into the chasm of exaggeration, we are drawn into satisfying a conception of ourselves that exceeds how we actually are. An impossible feat, right? We can't satisfy that because it doesn't exist. It's a fiction. Or falling into the chasm of denial, on the other hand, we lose sight of the value of morality and are drawn into ugly actions that undermine our own future. These are the dangers of these two chasms, these two extremes, is they keep you from actually finding the way out. You get further entrenched through the one that keeps you involved in that ignorance, and you get continuing to create your own suffering if you deny that things like karma exist. I mean, it's really disturbing to me when Buddhists, and sometimes fairly learned Buddhists, might say things like, "Oh, doesn't karma doesn't matter because it's all empty anyway," or "This doesn't matter because it's all empty anyway." It's the exact opposite. Because of emptiness, everything matters greatly. Everything is a product, again, of the causes and conditions and the other factors that bring it into existence. You have to be meticulous in paying attention to creating the proper causes and conditions to get the results that you want. Those results don't exist inherently, but they exist. Enlightenment doesn't exist inherently, but it exists. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say. Don't think that by negating intrinsic or inherent existence or any of these other ways we've talked about it, that you've negated existence, because you haven't. That's the goal. At least, if you fall into that nihilistic bent, then obviously you can hold that view. The last little point, I think I just got a minute or two to deal with this, is seeing the equality of dependent arising and emptiness. There's a wonderful chapter that pertains to this. And I just went right to the meditative reflection that's towards the end of it. And I'll start with this next week just as a way of reviewing, but I want to go through these points real quickly. They make the point of first, because persons and things are dependent arisings, they therefore are empty of inherent existence. Being dependent, they are not self-instituting. So if we look at once more, think of that word inherent that's on the screen as being independent. Because persons and things are dependent arisings, they're empty of independent existence. Being dependent, they can't institute themselves. They can't set themselves up. They don't have that autonomous, independent ability. These two concepts are completely complementary. Because things are dependent arisings, they are empty of inherent existence. Secondly, because persons and things are empty of inherent or independent existence, they must be dependent arisings. If phenomena did exist in their own right, from their own side, by way of their own nature, their own characteristics, they could not depend on other factors, either causes, their own parts, or again, thought, conceptual designation. Since phenomena are not able to set themselves up, they can transform, right? Because of emptiness, things function. We have dependent arisings. As I said just a few minutes ago, because of emptiness, we can talk about the causes and conditions that are needed to become enlightened, to have various things arise. We have to value that side of the equation as much as we value emptiness. Don't go to this thing of everything is empty, therefore doesn't matter. Everything is empty, therefore everything is a dependent arising, and we must be meticulous in caring for all the causes and conditions and everything that brings about the results we seek. Then the third is this final conclusion. These two realizations should work together, the one furthering the other. But of course, we don't have perfect minds. And so when we hear teachings like this, oh, everything is empty of inherent existence, and we tend to fall into this nihilistic bent. But then we have to go back to going, oh, but they do exist by way of all these various factors, their causes and conditions, their parts, their labeling. So then, we kind of get to the middle, but then we think, oh, but they must have some identity from their own side or they wouldn't exist at all. And so you end up with this kind of back and forth. And His Holiness, I didn't share that passage on the screen. There's a wonderful passage how he points to the fact that we should kind of go back and forth in our reasoning. Think about, first of all, how things are dependent arising. That reaffirms their existence. So as I've said tonight, I'm only pointing out how things actually exist. I've not pointed out that they don't exist at all. I've never said that. They do exist in these three ways. Use that as to kind of get you in the ballpark, but then to see, therefore, they've got to be empty of inherent existence, independent existence. They don't have that. And the reasoning we're going to look at next week gets you to that point a little more clearly of seeing that this inherently existent I or anything, we cannot find it. It doesn't exist. We have to go back and forth. His Holiness says, go back and forth between these two. Reaffirm that things exist, but then get at how they actually don't exist inherently. Then reaffirm how they still exist conventionally, yet they don't exist ultimately. And so on. You go back and forth, kind of strengthening both of these to find this middle way. I'd say this middle way is actually very fine between these two extremes. So we have to keep refining our awareness, especially through using the reasoning of dependent arising. That points to both of these facts, that things still do exist in a very slight way, yet they don't exist inherently. And that directly contradicts the ignorance that we've been kind of misled by since beginningless time. So sorry I went a little bit over tonight. It's about 3 minutes after. Let me see if there are any questions. And if they are too many, then we may just set them aside until the beginning of next week. But I do want to give some time to questions. If you have a question in the Gompa, please, the microphone is available, and that way I don't have to repeat it for the folks at home. It looks like Frank has a question. So
if you have a question online, please raise your hand or type it in chat.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Okay, Frank.
Very simple take on this might be, I mean, as far as for a purpose for a general life, is maybe we need to take some of the power away from the objects that seem to create everything in our world and make our world this big magical place. And if we can take some of that power away from them, we can get a better grasp of reality and where we stand in reality and how things create and how we affect reality, that kind of things. Things do exist. They're just not these big, powerful, like the beautiful dream car or whatever in people's lives. They just don't have the power that we're giving to them.
Exactly.
That's kind of the general on it.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can say that to a great degree. Yes, I mean the power. We don't want to deny again that certain results, due to their arising from causes and conditions, have greater qualities than other phenomena do. Like, for example, a Buddha. A Buddha is a being who was a being like us, a sentient being with a tortured, afflicted mind, going from life to life in confusion and craziness, who purified their mind and became, in a sense, a more powerful object, if you want to use the word power in that context. So we don't want to deny that things can actually improve in their qualities by virtue of following strenuously this and attentively this whole law of cause and effect and causing various things to occur. But we don't want to, again, hand over the power to objects that we're doing by virtue of our ignorance, where we think it's the object has that pleasantness and everything we're exaggerating from its own side. And that being drawn in then to having the attachment to it, because this is something we seek to desire this self, we are putting all of the power in those objects. And I agree with you, then we have to undermine that and think that, again, this is something I'm imputing as pleasant music, a delicious dessert, whatever the case might be. And that's nice that you have the karma to have that experience of something in that way, but that's not the way everybody sees it. It doesn't have any inherent pleasantness, likableness, deliciousness from its own side, kind of taking the power away from those objects. We don't want to, again, still get caught up in them in fictitious ways, but we want to be clear about where is it coming from? Its very identity is coming from our own minds, not coming from the basis. So I agree with you in that context, but again, I don't want to go too far in saying, because certain objects do have greater qualities than others, and that's a law of cause and effect and how things arise. A Buddha is a being of greater accomplishment and capacity than a sentient being like myself, right? So we can hold those things within this idea of them and not having anything from their own side, but rather things that arise on the basis of various factors, causes and conditions, and so on. Okay. Yeah, thank you for that comment. Yeah, Michael, you've got one in the Zoom room, please.
I have a question. How do you go from a place where, okay, I see things and as we're talking about, this is how I see it, right? And if I kind of rethink things, I can say, yeah, but it doesn't really exist. How do you go from one to flipping that around so that, okay, now my initial impression is this doesn't exist as I see it. Oh, but by the way, there's inherent existence.
And oh, by the way, there isn't inherent existence. Is that what you said?
Right. Right.
Okay. Yeah, because we have to be careful, because again, we're never denying mere existence. We're simply trying to be very clear about that kind of layer that we put on top of things that seems to give, again, to use what Frank just said, kind of the power to the object, that the object has all of that attractiveness and even the embellishment of attractiveness that attachment has. And to try to undermine that level that we're putting on top of it, that is saying it's resident in the object, as opposed to this is something that we're merely designated and imputing from our own side. And so there's no, and again, we have to be very careful with this. There's no real pleasurable object, and there's no real pleasure, and there's no real I that is experiencing that pleasure. But nonetheless, there's the mere I that has the mere pleasure at the mere pleasurable object. And that mere means that it's just existing within the realm of conceptual designation. Again, we're not denying that there's pleasure there or that there's a being experiencing pleasure. We're just denying how that is occurring. It's very fine, though, to remove that layer. And this is why we have to spend a lot of attention to really define what is that superimposition that we're putting on things? What is that false sense of existence that I've been introducing you to tonight? It requires a great investigation to make sure that that's what we're kind of picking off and not getting into utter non-existence, but rather lack of inherent existence. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, Michael, but I hope it got kind of in the right direction. So maybe, did you need it to say anything more?
Oh, like I said, I'm just trying to figure out how you go from where one is automatic and the other is kind of an afterthought to flipping those
Okay.
around. So when I look at things, I
Right.
think, oh, it doesn't exist as I see it.
I guess at some point, it's through familiarity, obviously. So the more that we work with this, the more that we will get to the same conclusion and not have it be an afterthought even, but rather when we see that things are merely imputed, that in and of itself speaks to its emptiness. That's what they say eventually you get to. And it's just, again, through the deepening of our meditation, through the deepening of our practice, the repeated analysis and repeated investigation and coming to that conclusion, that we see those two as pointing to the same reality. We're going to talk about this when we get to the fifth class, I'm sorry, where we talk about the two truths and how the two truths are kind of bound up in each other. Emptiness and dependent arising are kind of representative of these two truths. And we see that they're just two sides of the same coin. But to your point, I guess, is like, when we're focused on one side of the coin, how do we get to the other side rather than just having it as an afterthought? At some point, they become the same thought, I think, even though they are looking at two different aspects, because they're driving home the same point, the point we need to realize that will undermine the ignorance. Yeah. Please, Bill.
I'm curious whether you can apply the same type of analysis to non-physical things like.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little next week, I think. Because when we start talking about non-physical things, you can still talk about them in terms of temporal parts, for example, and also, again, that when we define something as anger, for example, well, what is anger? Again, we always have a definition for it, a refinement of what we are labeling as anger. So they all fall into that same schema of having these different dimensions of dependent arising. If I don't say it next week, I'll try to make a note when I get home, but please remind me to talk a little bit about that. But I think we should wrap things up. If you still have questions, please write them down. You'll get a chance to answer them. And so I think tonight, since I have gone a little over and I don't want to keep people too long, I really hate that I go over so much, but you all know me by now, so you know that it's hard for me to end on time. Let's just do some dedications mentally rather than reciting the prayers. First, we dedicate all the positive potential we've created for the result that we had set our sights on at the beginning of tonight, for the complete enlightenment of all beings, especially through our own attainment of that state. And may our wish to become enlightened, bodhicitta, become stronger and stronger, so it becomes a propelling force to take us all the way to that goal. Also, we pray for the good health and long lives of all of our precious gurus, especially His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and also for the very swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And then lastly, we dedicate for any beings that we're holding in our hearts, sharing this positive energy with them, with the strong wish that they find complete freedom from happiness and, freedom from suffering and everything that will bring them happiness. And may this be so for all beings, not just those, again, that we're holding close in our hearts, but for every being. Okay, thank you. Got kind of my words tangled in the end with trying to rush things, but I appreciate everyone being here. Again, if you have a chance to read some of the readings either from tonight that were introduced last week on your schedule, that would be useful to review those, what I talked about tonight, as well as to read ahead. That would be good for next week. So next week, we'll talk about the reasoning of the 4-point analysis and get into that. And again, I'll try to address some of the other things that were raised. Be well. Have a nice Thanksgiving, everyone. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to teach. So thank you so much.